Good evening, everybody, and let me start by thanking Dorothy and Jerry for inviting me here to speak with you this evening. It's a great privilege to be here. We've had a fantastic relationship with the INTO over the last 12 years, and I look forward to continuing our relationship with the INTO. But it's a great privilege to have the opportunity to deliver the 2018 Vere Foster Lecture. Teaching is a great profession, and I want to thank all the teachers out there for the work you do, for the work we do together. I feel very privileged and extremely lucky to have the great good fortune to be able to travel around the world, meeting with teachers, talking with teachers about teaching and talking about education. And tonight I'd just like to share with you some of the thoughts I have around teaching and education and some of the things I've learned from teachers around the world. First and foremost, my work with teachers has confirmed for me that no matter where we work, we all share a very significant common purpose. We care for children, we want them to grow, we want to do good for them, and we want them to be the best that they can be. Each teacher has their own style, their own philosophy, their own motivations. The challenge of an education system, I believe, is to embrace the energy, the diversity, and the drive that each individual teacher brings to the classroom each day, so as to allow creativity be at the centre of what we do. And I think it's wonderful tonight that we have such great creativity in the room, and I think we have to embrace creativity within the classroom rather than allowing it go down a very simplistic view of education. Reminds me of the story of George Best. Some of you may have heard before. George Best was dating Miss World, and he brought her to the races where they won thousands of pounds on the horses. Returning to their hotel room, they laid the money out on the bed and began counting it. They ordered 2 bottles of vintage champagne, and as they were beginning to count the money, the waiter arrived with the champagne. He looked at George, looked at the money, looked at the champagne, and without a trace of irony turned to George and said, "What's gone wrong?" I think looking at the talent in schools, looking at the amazing teachers out there, but at the same time looking at the way we treat education globally, we could ask the same question: what has gone wrong? Ken Robinson once said that he divides the world into 2 groups. However, Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher, spiked his argument by saying there are 2 types of people in the world: those who divide the world into 2 groups and those who don't. I kind of divide education systems into 2 types, the good and the bad. What perplexes me, however, is the almost universal acceptance that bad education systems are the best options we can have. Governments will make all kinds of excuses, as too will economists and administrators. Lack of investment will be justified on very spurious economic grounds. And Jerry just recently said in a printout publication that teachers cannot continue to have their cost of living eroded and their terms and conditions shaved in an effort to support not the children's education, but the duplication of back office functions. I hope I'm quoting you correctly. I cannot agree with that more. Teaching, I believe, is at a crossroads. Never before have teachers, teaching, and the future of teaching had such elevated importance. One road is a direct assault on teachers' pensions and security. As we are only too well aware, this comes out of the financial crisis and the sense that the fat cat, superannuated public servants should pay the price. But as Andy Hargreaves and Michael Fullen have pointed out so clearly, there is no evidence that less security will actually increase the quality of teaching. A second and related false road comes from the United States, where teachers are paid based on their performance and the performance of the students, the so-called race to the top grants. This corrosive methodology of payment by results has seeped into education initiatives in the developing world or the global south, and has given rise to a very restricted interpretation of what education should look like: numeracy and literacy and very little else. A third road is to make teaching simpler, taking the attitude that anyone can do it. Narrow the curriculum, turn to technology, prescribe and paste the instruction, teach to the test, standardise instruction, and reduce teachers to mere delivery agents. This particular approach is familiar, at least in part, to many of us, and is the approach taken again in many developing world countries as there is an increased demand for education. It is crucial in the conversation on global education to point out that countries that have high-performing education systems and high-performing economies have not taken these roads. We must ensure that we guard against going down these roads ourselves. And as educators and education professionals, and indeed trade unions, we must advocate against moving down these roads on a global basis. A bad education system is never a good option. It may be the cheapest option, but it's never the best option. Equally, we now more or less know how to build a good education system. So what is preventing us from doing it? Instead of a fundamental transformation of a bad system, policymakers demand reform. But try as you may, you cannot reform a broken system. It needs to be rebuilt, and rebuilt totally. When I was asked to give a working title for this, I suggested something like Supporting Teachers' Professionalism for the Achievement of Quality Education Globally. It's a bit of a mouthful, I appreciate that. But it's very clear to me, and I'm assuming it is clear to many of you, that quality education can only be achieved if it is driven by great teachers. And ultimately, I believe that the positioning of the teacher within our education system will lead to the system becoming either a good system or a bad system. Notwithstanding this assertion, the most abused educational research finding these days is the claim that the quality of the teacher is the single most important determinant of the learning of the student. The claim is that teachers determine student test scores, and test scores may be used to identify and reward effective teaching. And of course, to fire those who aren't effective. The reality is that test scores are not the best way to identify the best teachers. And again, I was interested to see this matter raised in printout quite recently. But where do these ideas come from? One important source is the work of William Sanders from Tennessee, who in 1998 claimed that his statistical modelling could demonstrate how much value a teacher added to students' test performance. And by monitoring students' progress on standardised tests from year to year, Sanders figured out that he could isolate the value added by the teacher to that child. In addition, he reasoned that the racial and socioeconomic characteristics of the student became unimportant once he built his economic model. Sanders made some remarkable claims about the impact of individual teacher quality on student achievement. For example, using value-added evidence that took two hypothetical students starting equally at the 50th percentile, he showed that what happened when student A received 3 years of learning from a high-quality teacher, someone deemed by Sanders to be the top 20%, while student B experienced 3 years from a low-performing teacher, someone deemed to be in the bottom 20%. At the end of the 3 years, Sanders predicted that student A would perform at the 90th percentile, while student B would operate and perform at the 37th percentile. One goes up, one goes down. Now, while this evidence seems very outdated and very questionable, in 2010, the Los Angeles Times presented an even more explosive finding. They accessed data from schools in one of the lowest performing districts in the United States, and they were able to show differences of up to 41% in value-added performance between teachers of the same children in the same school. This created a perfect storm for politicians and pundits. Ditch the slackers, reward the best teachers. And this, my friends, is unfortunately the more or less accepted wisdom of the United States today. Manage a national education system as you would a for-profit company, and in lots of cases, let the national education system operate for profit. If this mentality were restricted to the United States alone, it would be bad enough. But through the actions of certain NGOs and such philanthropists, unlike Vere Foster, but philanthropists such as Bill and Melinda Gates, Mark Zuckerberg and others, the corrosive methodology has allowed such institutions as Teach for America expand to become Teach for India, Teach for Haiti. It has allowed KIPP, or the Knowledge is Power program, roll out in some of the poorest countries of the world. It has created the so-called charter schools and voucher systems, which have sucked the energy from an already ailing public education system and has not, as claimed, made education available to the poorest of the poor, but rather made education available to those who can afford it. This misplaced corporate reforming focus on individual teacher quality has become common currency, even though there is very little evidence to show that this actually works. Educators, on the other hand, know that every child can learn, but they understand that children learn at different rates, and some inevitably learn more than others. Educators recognise that some children have more advantages and faster starts than others. Educators recognise that some children have disabilities that interfere with their learning. Not all children start at the same place and not all children end up at the same place. So why, oh why, are standardised test scores used to determine whether or not a child is learning? And how in the name of goodness can standardised test scores act as a measure of effective teaching? Meanwhile, back in America, where this model was born and where the privatisation of education continues apace, public schools, where they still grip on in certain states by their fingernails, generally do as well, if not better, than many charter schools. And in Nebraska, for example, where a statewide decision was made to ignore such policies around privatisation, standardised testing, and performance, and a big effort was made by the state to support a more child-centred, holistic public education system and one which values teachers, evidence shows that in national exams, kids from Nebraska are doing as well, if not better, than kids coming from charter schools. In 2016, an interview with the National Public Education Advocate Diane Ravitch, you may have heard of her, shared her views on the importance of public schools in the United States and why Nebraska's schools are one of the highest performing schools in the country. And this came into a national movement called Nebraska Loves Public Schools. Elsewhere, countries such as Finland, Canada, Japan have worked out that it is not the effect of the individual teacher that counts, but rather the main point should be how you maximise the cumulative effect of every teacher over time for each and every student. Students do well because they have a series of good teachers, not by chance, but by design. In other words, you have to transform the entire profession, not the bottom 20% or the top 20%, but the 100%. And this requires a serious commitment by government around the world, a commitment I believe lots of governments don't fully understand. In simple terms, I believe we need to attract the best people into teaching, not only in Northern Ireland, but indeed in the global north, but also, and crucially, right across the globe, if we are serious about the value of education and its transformative power. We then need to ensure that the training the teachers get prepares them for the job they are going to undertake. And this training is not something which is done at the beginning of a career, but is something teachers will embrace right the way through their career, just like many other professions. And I know the INTO should be commended for the quality of their ongoing CPD for the members. Every effort must be made to retain teachers within the profession. Teaching must be attractive, it must be challenging, and it must be rewarding. And maybe, just maybe, we'll wake up to the idea of paying teachers the salaries they deserve, not just in Northern Ireland, but around the world. This clearly requires a reimagining of what we believe the teaching profession should look like. It calls on teacher training colleges and institutions to question the role they play and will continue to play in the lifetime of a teacher. It calls on teacher unions, teacher leaders and managers to see collaboration as the way forward. All stakeholders must be made accountable to ensure inclusive and quality education. India is a country, as Dorothy has said, that Dorothy and I are reasonably familiar with. And unfortunately, it's a country which doesn't value its public education system, nor indeed its teachers. In 2016-17, it spent a paltry 3.65% on its total budget on education, maintained a national pupil-teacher ratio of 100:1, and continued its policy of promoting private education run by such agencies as Pearson's and the like. In one large private school, which I visited recently, where there were over 3,000 pupils, interactive whiteboards were installed in every single room. Teachers were not equipped to mediate the material. Rather, the IT companies that installed the interactive whiteboards had provided a series of technicians, and these technicians streamed the relevant material to each room for consumption by the students, while the teacher stood by the board and read from the board. This is one of the worst successes of what Hargreaves and Fullan might refer to as a business capital view of teaching. In their book, Professional Capital in 2012, Hargreaves and Fullan present two competing views of teaching. They refer to them as the business capital view and the professional capital view. The business capital view assumes that good teaching may be emotionally draining, but is technically simple. It's a quick study, which really only requires moderate intellectual ability. It's hard at first, but with dedication it can be mastered readily. That it should be driven by hard performance data about what works and where best to target one's efforts. That it comes down to enthusiasm, hard work, raw talent, and measurable results. And finally, that it's often replaceable by online instruction. A professional capital view assumes, by contrast, that good teaching is technically sophisticated and difficult, requires high levels of education and long periods of training, is perfected through continuous improvement, involves wise judgment informed by experience and evidence, that good teaching is a collaborative accomplishment and responsibility, and that it maximizes, mediates, and moderates online material. Hargreaves and Fullan's two contrasting views of teaching is more than just a theoretical exercise. A direct line can be drawn between a business capital view and the non-performing, non-functioning, bad education systems such as existing in the United States, United Kingdom, and worryingly, in much of the developing world. Equally, where a professional capital view exists, high-performing, high-functioning, good education systems occur, and we're talking about the countries we always hear about, the Finlands, the Japans, the Koreas, and the Canadas. To me, this is an important piece of evidence to support the view around how to build a good education system, or indeed how to build a bad one. It's all about how you view and treat your teachers. I was recently in Sierra Leone, where Global Schoolroom has been working for the last 2 years to build capacity of teachers within networks of schools. And the conversation, as always, comes around to the position of teachers in society. Some older teachers remember when Sierra Leone was considered the Greece of West Africa, a time when both education and teachers were valued. Now, whole generations have missed out on education because of civil war and Ebola. Education is still valued, but teachers are not. Years of political mismanagement and corruption has resulted in largely a non-functioning public education system. And there is almost entire reliance on a combination of Irish and international missionary congregations to manage the system. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but it would make an awful lot more sense if the government could at least have some role in the management of the schools. In many schools, teacher vacancies exist, but cannot be officially filled because of the clogging up of the system by so-called ghost teachers. As a result, school managers will try to find funds elsewhere to pay teachers no more than a stipend to fill these vacancies. Teachers will readily admit that while they love teaching, and indeed they do, I believe they do, and I've seen some really good teaching, if another non-teaching job came along, of course they'd leave. Who could blame them? In Sierra Leone, the public education system is badly broken, and within a badly broken system, we see the role of teachers is not valued and is being even further diminished. It is considered a technically simple job to be done by poorly trained, uneducated people who can follow a teacher-proofed curriculum, which is often developed by international NGOs. The assessment of students is done through a very high-stake exam system, again often developed by international NGOs, success in which is brought about through rote learning, Teachers lose their jobs based on the results of this high-stakes exam, and younger teachers are ready to take the role that is left when the teacher leaves. Worryingly, I've witnessed the same scenarios right across much of Africa, where a broken education is simply propped up and where high-stakes student assessment follows the delivery of a teacher-proofed curriculum. The information I've shared with you from the United States, India, Sierra Leone, can all be brought together under the colours of the global education reform movement, or GERM, as Pasi Sahlberg so deftly put it. In his book, Finished Lessons, he outlines how by transforming education, we bring about the best conditions for young people to become engaged learners, fulfilled individuals, and compassionate and productive citizens. The global education reform movement may declare this intention also, but the practice which they promote in schools has largely had the opposite effect. The global education reform movement is predicated on competition between schools, standardised learning, a focus on literacy and numeracy, test-based accountability, and school choice. In Finland, on the other hand, collaboration among schools is favoured over competition, personalised learning is favoured over standardised testing. The focus is on the whole child rather than a narrow view of numeracy and literacy. Trust-based responsibility replaces test-based accountability, and equity of outcome replaces school choice. The voices of educators are rarely heard in the education policy and reform business, and the symptoms of GERM, as Northern Ireland teachers know, include top-heavy planning, rigid curricula, fixed measures, external inspections, and externally judged accountability. This must be resisted. It is not educationally sound, and as educational professionals, we cannot stand by and allow these things to happen. The 2013-2014 UNESCO Education for All Global Monitoring Report discussed the transformative power of education, and the authors presented evidence to show that education reduces poverty, boosts jobs and growth, improves people's chances of healthier life, and promotes a healthier society. Just to give you a couple of examples, if all children leave school with basic reading skills, it's estimated 171 million people could be lifted out of poverty. If all women completed primary education, there would be 66 fewer maternal deaths, and citizens are twice as likely to sign a petition if they have attended secondary school. For many years, I have highlighted the need to ensure the provision of quality education, and have argued that unless we get education right, we'll have little chance of getting any other form of development sorted out. In an article in the Irish Independent this week, I called on all stakeholders in education, teachers, schools, students, parents, government, and increasingly the private sector, to take their role seriously and to be accountable. However, while it is generally accepted that education is a good thing, what is often left out of the conversation is the need to have quality education go hand in hand with adequately trained and supported autonomous and professional teachers. My experiences in the developing world clearly points out the way in which teachers are undervalued. When donors and education NGOs are interrogated on the reasons for this, they will regularly admit that they cannot afford to get involved in teacher education. As a result, they themselves will undertake short-term, large-scale numeracy and literacy programs which can generate results and, when framed appropriately, can demonstrate impact. Identifying good indicators of results is challenging at the best of times, and it is generally acknowledged that estimating and achieving results in teacher education is not straightforward. Not one peer-reviewed data is available on the impact of teacher education on education in the developing world. This is a trend we are endeavouring to change. Very few agencies other than our own are interested in teacher education in the developing world, and this is indicative of the attitude to teachers and education more generally. One of the main reasons for this is that education has been ever present but rarely dominant within Irish or international development programmes. Irish Aid, for example, provides support to an extensive range of bodies. While multilateral organisations comprise 61% of beneficiaries of total official development aid, a significant 23%, or more than 165 million, is allocated to various NGOs. Within the overall distribution of support funding, education as an explicit sector comprises 4% of the total provision. However, the definition and interpretation of what constitutes educational activity can vary considerably, not to speak of the spectrum of orientation and trust of educational initiatives. A recent research project I've been involved in pointed to a large range of definitions and interpretations of education, and a lack of understanding amongst donors of the key elements in the provision of education, one of which crucially is teachers. There also tends to be an acceptance amongst donors of the bona fides and technical expertise of the larger civil society partners who engage in education projects. This is worrying, as privatisation in education has been widely embraced by governments around the world and often supported by certain intergovernmental organisations, transitional corporations and international NGOs. However, the idea of privatisation has been interpreted and translated into educational practice in many ways, and the forms that privatisation takes at different levels of education varies across systems, as do the rationale used to justify them. Education International, for instance, holds a very clear view on the on the dangers of privatisation in education. Global trends towards privatisation of education is accompanied by some serious problems for the future of individuals and communities that find themselves at the wrong end of the social hierarchy to which this neoliberal rationality has given rise. However, in an era of expanding demand for education, the idea that education should and can be managed and funded entirely by the state may be no longer feasible. This is a very significant challenge and one we must face. Privatisation needs therefore to be democratically controlled so as to preserve education's traditional purpose of community building and working together towards social cohesion and solidarity, and so resisting market fundamentalism. In conclusion, I believe that the challenges are significant but not insurmountable. There are blueprints which we can follow. There are clear ideas of how to build good education systems. It involves creating and supporting great teachers. It involves trusting teachers. It involves treating teachers as the professionals that they are. With this trust comes great responsibility, but responsibility I believe teachers can and will step up to and embrace. Thank you very much.